Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Beneath the Red Star podcast, a Russian history podcast for normal people. As always, I'm your host, Kyle. Today, I have a continuation of a theme that I've noticed that a number of people have been kind of digging lately, and that is the discussion of different religious and ethnic groups in the Russian Empire. Recently, I was looking at which episodes had been listened to the most, and I realized almost all of the episodes people really liked were all related to the demographics of Russia. So, I decided, let's give the people what they want. Today, we are going to be talking about some more offbeat Russian religions, and ultimately, we are going to be talking about how the Russian government really fucking hated these people and made their lives a living hell. You know, I don't actually always want to talk about revolution, dissent, and oppression, but it's the Russian Empire and Russian history in general. You kind of have to talk about it because of, all these things are, incredibly fucking central to the very concept of the Russian government and Russian identity, both then and now. Arguably, at least anyways. Anyhow, today we are going to be discussing two religious groups known as the Molokans and the Doukhobors. These groups are actually very related and are oftentimes in scholarly sources referred to together as the spiritual Christians or as spiritual Christian groups. In a lot of ways, these groups are really similar, and their histories are in many ways really a shared one. But enough of this preamble shit, let's get right into it. So, both groups don't have necessarily a super clean start date, as is pretty common for a lot of these kind of religious offshoots, especially ones that are, not sanctioned by the state. But it is believed that they were founded in the 1760s, around the year 1760 itself, as that is the first time we really see any record of these groups popping up in the official record. But while we do not super know when exactly they came to be, we do know more or less exactly where. That would be in and around the town of Tambov, in what is now southern Russia, not super far from the Ukrainian border. This religious movement was somewhat unique in how it started. Unlike what seems to be the pretty standard thing for religious movements, especially those in Russia, this was not a peasant movement. Or, well, not really a peasant-dominated movement, not really at first. Basically, spiritual Christianity shows up in the 1760s and finds popularity pretty rapidly among local landholders in the region, particularly these kind of small-time landowners known as smallholders, who were starting to really feel the squeeze of the Russian government. You see, Tambov and the surrounding area was, at the time, very much so on the edge of the Russian Empire. The European steppe was yet to be taken over and totally populated. It was very much so the frontier, and as such, the people there wore the yoke of the empire lightly. But the Russian Empire was expanding and growing and consolidating its power. And this consolidation of power was done in two ways. One, the Russian government was enforcing serfdom and creating stronger and stricter controls on who could and couldn't own land and who could and couldn't freely travel around the country, which muscled many of these small holders out of their land, thus leaving them as state peasants or riding the line just above peasantry. And two, the church was imposing its beliefs and establishing a permanent presence in the region by establishing a proper bishop and whatnot. And remember, the church was very much so seen as an arm of the state because it was an arm of the state. The church was an important part of the Russianization process for areas not only on a cultural level, but also because of its close connections to the Russian government. If you're a longtime listener, then think back to the Ivan the Terrible episode and how he legitimated his rule through the church, and the church legitimated its power through the state. The exact same thing happened from then all the way to when we're talking about now. So, the church and the state were starting to get a little bit too controlling for many of these people. So, these folks started to fall in with these spiritual Christians. But what did the spiritual Christians believe? Well, let's start broad and get a little bit more specific. At the broad level, the reason they were considered spiritual is because they rejected a lot of the more concrete orthodox structures of, well, the Orthodox Church. This is a lot like what we discussed when we were talking about the Christi and the Old Believers in the previous Offbeat Religion episode. For those who don't know or don't remember, we discussed that a lot of these offshoot religions went in one of two directions. Either they stuck with kind of priest-driven norms, normal forms of worship, or they completely abandoned the traditional church hierarchy altogether. The spiritual Christians were the latter. They 100% emphatically abandoned church tradition and traditional church hierarchies and a lot of what was kind of normal Orthodox church doctrine. Instead, both the Doukhobors and the Molokans focused less so on church structure and how it and the regimented study of the Bible would bring you closer to God, and rather focused more so on individual study and revelation. This might seem a little bit familiar to what we talked about previously with the Christi, who also went down a fairly similar path. The Molokans, for their part, did still read the Bible, but the Doukhobors did not. Instead, they opted to pass on hymns, songs, and scripture via an oral tradition known as the Living Book. Not only did the spiritual Christians cast off church hierarchy, they also cast off the social, political, and economic hierarchy of the Russian Empire, though the Doukhobors were much more into this than the Molokans. The Molokans still believed in things like property rights and ownership and stuff like that, while the Doukhobors got really into kind of total equality in every facet across all lines, and were not really into things like private property ownership. And actually, the Molokans were able to be quite wealthy and influential, usually just within the areas where they lived, because of their willingness to engage in traditional commerce. This was kind of in contrast to the other sects, say like the Doukhobors, who were not really interested in engaging in kind of a market or later capitalist ideas of trade, but also the Molokans were not weighed down by the social and economic constraints of the Tsar. As such, they were able to amass some pretty serious wealth, and much like the Jews and how they were seen as kind of outsiders who were using their money and influence to influence local politics or local commerce, and that people were angry about it, well, this was very much so something that the Molokans dealt with as well, as people saw them as kind of, much like the Jews, of money-grubbing, backstabbing wheeler and dealer types. But anyways, both of these ideologies, the Molokans and the Doukhobors, were what you'd really kind of call a utopian ideology. And these spiritual Christian groups tended to isolate themselves away from their Orthodox neighbors so that they could live communally and support each other in their way of life. So this is kind of like, hippie commune stuff here, though it's, inherently Christian as opposed to, say, secular or even atheistic. This isolation and the way of life that they lived also changed the way that they practiced Christianity outside of their abandonment of church hierarchy. For the Doukhobors, this included things like banning the consumption of intoxicants, such as alcohol or tobacco. And for the Molokans, this included rejecting a number of traditional Christian holidays, but still accepting some kind of holdovers from the Torah, such as the laws of kashrut. As well, they allowed the drinking of milk and eating of dairy products during Lent, something that was not allowed in the Orthodox community. This eating of dairy is actually where the term Molokan comes from. Molokan comes from the Russian word for moloko. Molokan is roughly translated to milk drinker, and literally translated would probably be the one who drinks milk, something like that. And speaking of names, the term Doukhobor translates to spirit wrestler. This term was originally an insult lobbed at the Doukhobors because they were originally accused of wrestling against the Holy Spirit. As you can tell, I'm referring to them by this name, so it's not really a mean or bad thing to say. Instead, the Doukhobors took the name and bore it for themselves, stating that they both wrestled with the Holy Spirit, but that they also wrestled for it, echoing not only the story of Jacob who wrestled with God, but also to show their commitment to fight for their beliefs. Which is honestly kind of interesting, because neither the Molokans nor the Doukhobors would be doing any fighting. Both of these sects were strict and virulent pacifists. Now that you understand a little bit about these guys, we need to talk a little bit about how the Russian Empire responded to them popping into the scene in the late 18th century. Well, the Russian Empire, like basically every empire of this vintage, was not what you would call particularly religiously tolerant, and even by the standards of the time, the Russian Empire was pretty bad about this and had no chill about anything really at all. As we have discussed previously, the Russian Empire was an Orthodox country, and its government was strictly Eastern Orthodox. And the Orthodox Church was directly tied to the power of the Russian state, and vice versa. The priests and bishops and archbishops and all the other ranks of the church that I don't know and won't remember were all basically employees of the Russian imperial government. And the actions they took were oftentimes directed by the Tsarist government. And many of the things that the Russian clergy were on the lookout for, what they would have often referred to as, say, apostasy or heresy, or generally just not being a good Christian, could be chalked up to just being a dissident of either religious or political nature. And to deal with these political or religious dissenters, the church could deploy agents of the state to, say, make arrests or exile people. So, when the Molokans and the Doukhobors hit the scene, they were really ruffling some feathers. On the one hand, they rejected the supremacy of the Orthodox Church and refused to listen to its teachings. The church was not happy about this because, well, of course they don't like it. These guys are saying their religion is wrong, and that they're not going to give their support to the church or even listen to or respect it. And this religious issue also frustrated the Russian state because it meant that the ideas that the state wanted disseminated through the church were not reaching these people, thus making them harder to influence, and their refusal to interact with the church made it harder for the government to, say, keep tabs on them through the church. And on the other hand, these guys did not recognize or respect the authority of the Russian government directly. They believe everyone's equal, and they don't believe in the draft. Not even the draft! Господи! As you might imagine, the Tsar doesn't like being told, fuck you, I ain't listening, because I think we're the same. Yeah, you and me, a dirty, stinking peasant. So, as we've discussed at various other points, when the Tsar and the church feel like they're being snubbed by people that they don't really like, well, they react with the kind of chill, calm demeanor that large, powerful state and religious institutions are known for. I.e., they send in the troops to fuck these guys up. Okay, I'm being a bit hyperbolic here, but only a smidge. In 1763, roughly 3 years after the kind of accepted start date for spiritual Christianity, the bishop who oversaw the Tambov region, remember this is a new guy on the scene, sent soldiers, literal, honest-to-God soldiers, like with guns and everything, to arrest a man named Leon Poborokhin. Poborokhin was a founding member of the Doukhobors. Fortunately for Poborokhin, he just so happened to have left and, well, was somewhere else at the time when the jackboots showed up. So, lucky for him, he missed his opportunity at 3 hots and a cot, either in a monastery or in a prison somewhere. A year later, the troops came back to arrest Poborokhin again, but once again, they had been foiled and Poborokhin was nowhere to be found. Upon asking around, they found out that he left town a while ago, probably not long after their first attempt, and was no longer living there. But even without Poborokhin, the Russian government and church decided it was time to crack down on these blasphemers, those being the spiritual Christians and their smallholder supporters. So, the Russian government did what the Russian government does. They started making arrests. A number of arrests would be the smallholders, and their land would then be repossessed by the Russian government, or the church, or just kind of other wealthy people who had the cash to buy it up. As I said before, this was all being overseen by a bishop in the region. And again, I'd just like to point out, this is pretty clearly like an issue of the state. So here's this bishop pretty clearly working as an agent of the state. But anyhow, this bishop would be the Honorable Bishop Pachomy. Pachomy was known in the region as a hilariously corrupt man, but one who was very effective in his repression and extortion of these spiritual Christians. As we talked about before, towards the beginning of the episode, this area was quickly being brought into the fold, and Pachomy, the new bishop, he was really important in all of this. in spite of his corruption, he was actually really good at dropping the hammer on those who didn't conform to religious and political doctrine, and also in just kind of normal statecraft, organizing the local government and things like that. As such, he became the personal, physical representation of all that was wrong with the Russian government and the Orthodox Church and their own corruption and violent behaviors in that region. He was more or less the kind of acting governor in a lot of ways, and so when his jackbooted thugs came and took people away or stole their stuff or, I don't know, just were generally, well, jackbooted thugs, it was him that they saw. And, well, he, again, was a representative of the government, so let's just say this didn't really engender strong positive feelings between the people of Tambov and the folks in St. Petersburg. But then something happened in 1774. The Russo-Turkish War of 1768 to 1774 just ended. With the end of the war, Russia captured some pretty serious territory from the Ottoman Empire. And with that, the Russian government was kind of interested in sending some Russians to these new lands in order to reinforce both their governmental and societal control over these new lands. It's time to Russianize, baby. So, they sent some people they didn't really care about. You see, this whole colonizing thing is dangerous work, and we don't really want to send people that we're, worried about. Instead, we can send the spiritual Christians. And in a way, this arrangement was actually a bit of a win-win. For the Russians, they got the spiritual Christians farther away from the seat of government power, and for the spiritual Christians, well, they got the same thing. So the Molokans and the Doukhobors agreed to be resettled to that most famous of sorta islands in the Black Sea, Crimea. Granted, not all of them did go, but a lot of them did, like most of them. Anyhow, for a good while they stayed in Crimea and things were pretty chill, or, well, as chill as things can be as a religious minority in the Russian Empire. Which is to say, not really chill at all, but hey, at least for now, no one was actively trying to imprison, exile, or kill everyone. So, that's a start. But as the 18th century became the 19th century, the Russian Empire experienced an explosion of religious groups popping up, and once again, the Russian government did what the Russian government does. It started violating the human rights of its subjects. This time around, it was not done with the so overt and ham-fisted ways of the last time. There would be no troops marching in to, crack down on these guys. No, this time the Russian government did another thing the Russian government is really well known for. Violating said human rights via the secret police. You see, the Russian government did not see the spiritual Christians as simply religious men, and actually didn't see them as religious people at all. Instead, the Russian government operated under the idea that the spiritual Christians were actually a radical political movement that was just using the trappings of religion and, the excuse of religious expression to bring in new members into their political group. While this was entirely wrong, I can kind of understand a little bit why the Russian government may have thought this. This was a religious group, but it also was a very political one. I mean, as a general rule, religion and politics kind of go together really well, and as you can see, say, in this election here in the United States that's going to be happening next week, as of recording time, religious groups make up big voting blocks. Religious groups tend to be political. And, well, these guys were political, but they also were religious. But again, as I was saying, I can understand at least a little bit why the Russian government may have held this wrong conclusion. The time period we're talking about here is the early 19th century. This is the same time that all those radical liberal groups that would ultimately make up the Decembrists were out doing their radical liberal Decembrist things. And to be fair to the Russian government again, they did see a lot of people joining up with the Molokans and the Doukhobors and other radical dissident religious groups for their political views on, say, things like inherent equality and their disdain for and refusal to participate in serfdom. So there's a lot of political organizations out there that are getting into maybe a little more radical ideas, and also there's a lot of people who are joining these more radical religious groups as well. So yeah, kind of makes sense. This, of course, put the Russian government on a bit of high alert. Though the Decemberists had not struck just yet, that would be pretty soon though, and there were certain kinds of building blocks that the Russian government was likely aware of, such as that, again, a lot of people are joining up with these more radical organizations. But anyhow, things were tense, and the Russian government knew it. They knew that people were mad at the state of things, and they also knew that them being mad at the state of things meant they were mad at, well, the state. So, in an effort to punish and control the spiritual Christians and these other radical sects lurking out there in the Russian wilderness, Tsar Alexander I created the Secret Committee for Schismatic Affairs in the year 1825. Because, if we want to fix the fact that everyone's angry, just going out and spreading, fucking secret policemen around is definitely the way to do it. Well, I guess it is if you're the Tsar. The goal of this organization, that being the Secret Committee for Schismatic Affairs, was to find religious dissidents and do something about them. The way this materialized was with various secret committees being set up all over the Russian Empire, who would then spy on people and find out their beliefs, and then they would, say, arrest them or exile them to places like the Caucasus Mountains or Siberia. And what's really fun about these committees is that they had no oversight, at least not outside of the kind of bigger committee. They didn't answer to anyone outside of their organization, and they operated in complete secrecy. As such, almost all of the government and the church had no idea who these dudes were and or what they were doing. This is what you call a really good recipe for some horrifying human rights abuses. But since all of this was done in near total secrecy, it's really hard to say just what all they did to how many people. But it is estimated that tens of thousands of people were likely processed by these committees, with an unknowable number being arrested or sent to Siberia or sent to the Caucasus Mountains or wherever the hell else. But speaking of the Caucasus Mountains were the new edge of the Russian Empire, and it, much like Crimea was, is now in need of Russianization and colonization. And it is there, to the Caucasus Mountains, that most of the spiritual Christians would ultimately go in the year 1839. Even with this serious oppression visited upon them by these secret committees, most of the Molokans and Doukhobors stuck it out in Crimea until they were given another resettlement deal by the Russian government. This time, the government of Nikolai I offered them another deal similar to what they were offered when they came to Crimea. But this time, the Tsar had done a few things to kind of sweeten the deal. Not only would the Tsar allow the spiritual Christians to go to the new edge of the Russian Empire, thus again removing them from the government's spotlight, the government also offered them the opportunity of immunity from the draft for the next 50 years. For the spiritual Christians, it's a pretty damn good deal considering that the Russian draft was incredibly oppressive and ever-present. This was a big sticking point for this group. They would go even farther away from the Tsar and his agents, and they, as adamant pacifists, would be able to escape the draft. This is pretty much too good to pass up. So, the spiritual Christians would pack up their stuff and set off for the new land at the request of the Tsar. Ultimately, these guys would settle down in the areas that are now modern-day Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. And wouldn't you know it, the Tsar actually held up his end of the bargain. For 50 years, the spiritual Christians chilled in the Caucasus pretty much without Russian government interference. But then, in 1889, 50 years after the spiritual Christians moved to the Caucasus, their deal with the Tsar came to an end. They petitioned the Tsar to extend their deal, but the Tsar had no interest in allowing them to escape military service forever, and once again, things became very tense between the spiritual Christians and the Tsar. This all ultimately boiled to a head when in 1895, the Molokans and Doukhobors, in what is now Azerbaijan, got together for what is known as the Burning of the Arms. The Burning of the Arms is, well, more or less exactly what it sounds like. Roughly 7,000 spiritual Christians gathered up any and every weapon that they could get their hands on in the area, doused them in kerosene, and burned them while singing hymns about peace. While this was a peaceful demonstration, the spiritual Christians once again got that classic Russian government treatment and were cracked down on violently by the government. Hundreds of people were arrested and thousands were exiled deep into Siberia. And it was at this point that the Molokans and Doukhobors began deciding en masse that they had had just about enough. In 1899, the majority of Doukhobors packed up their things and shipped off to Canada. For the Molokans, it would take a little bit longer than that for them to ultimately decide that it was time to go. This, though, would not be that much later. This all really starts in 1904. This begins when large numbers of Molokans started fleeing from the Russian Empire to the United States in order to avoid the draft for the Russo-Japanese War. In the early years of the 20th century, the Doukhobors and Molokans started to arrive on the coasts of the US and Canada. Well, the West Coast in particular, though it is kind of interesting. A number of them did go basically all the way around the world. They would go from, say, the Caucasus through Russia to the west, through Europe across the ocean, into the United States in places like Galveston or New York, and then cross the country to get to places such as California, Oregon, Washington, up into Canada, stuff like that. But broadly speaking, they just went to the West Coast. One way or another, most of them did not stop in other places. Anyhow, I digress. To this day, there are still a number of Doukhobors and Molokans living in parts of North America. Chiefly, the Doukhobors live on the western coast of Canada, not far to the east of Vancouver, while the Molokans mostly spread out in California near the large cities of San Francisco in the north and Los Angeles in the south. But both groups do see members all across the Pacific Northwest. It's hard to say how many members of the Doukhobors and Molokans are still out there in North America, let alone Russia, but it's believed that it's not a whole lot of them. Right now, kind of most of the understanding and scholarship focused on the Doukhobors and on the Molokans is focused on North America, because most of the Molokans and Doukhobors did leave Russia in the early 20th century to come to the States or to Canada. So I really don't know how many Molokans are out there. That number completely eludes me, and I've not been able to really find information on that. But I don't imagine it's a whole lot, because I do know that there were about 100,000 in the kind of pre-revolution years, early 20th century, and so I don't imagine there's a ton now. For the Doukhobors, I do have a little bit more of a solid number. It is believed that there are less than 2,000 people who identify as Doukhobors in Canada, and that there are about 30,000 people who are of Doukhobor descent. While these groups are fairly small, they're both pretty well connected with their Russian past, and in Doukhobor and Molokan families, it's still very common for people to dress in Russian style, especially for, say, like holidays and festivals and stuff like that, and to converse with each other in Russian, and to educate their children in Russian, as well as to sometimes even go back to Russia, though that's less so now, but we'll talk about that in a second. Like the Old Believers, the Molokans tend to be a little bit more isolated from everyone else and tend to broadly keep to themselves. But this does differ kind of group to group, because in the US, there are about 5 different Molokan sects. Again, I don't really know how big they are, but there are 5 of them out there. And then, unlike the Molokans and the Old Believers, the Doukhobors are much more integrated into kind of normal mainstream society, except there is one major sticking issue. Remember what I said about the Doukhobors. They're not really into, say, property ownership, and they're really into kind of radical equality. And well, I meant it, and that hasn't changed. In Doukhobor society, there are still those who really are into that kind of more traditionalist view on, say, personal property, particularly the ownership of things like homes. And, well, they sometimes go about this by, say, lighting those homes on fire. And not infrequently, they will do this while naked. These people are oftentimes members of what is known as the Freedomite movement, which is a Doukhobor splinter sect that you could kind of call a Doukhobor fundamentalist group. And what's really kind of interesting about this group is that they're not a Russian group. Well, they're Russian in the sense that the Doukhobors are Russian, but the movement started in 1921. This is over 20 years since the Doukhobors had come to Canada. This is an evolution of the group that happened after their kind of de-Russianization, I guess, after their immigration from the Russian Empire. But anyways, these groups have pretty much integrated themselves into their respective new societies and try to keep their old ways alive as best they can. But they have been struggling with their connections to their old homeland, as I was saying before. This has a lot to do with the current war in Ukraine, which, as pacifists, the Molokans and Doukhobors are pretty opposed to. They're not real fans of all this kind of, shooting at each other stuff, which really has put a damper on their ability to interact with their old country, because they are still pretty well connected with where they had come from. And many of these folks have been back to Russia, particularly in the past, for things like schooling or to visit family or whatever. But now, because of, one, their moral issues in opposition to the war, and also the very real kind of logistical issues of going to a country that the United States is kind of sort of in a proxy war with, has made that hard. But if you are in the United States or in Canada and you ever find yourself in the Pacific Northwest, or say near Vancouver, keep an eye out for information about these folks, like the National Doukhobor Heritage Village in Saskatchewan, not super far from Vancouver. This village is a, village that was constructed in 1917 and has been preserved all this time as a museum about Doukhobor history and culture. So, there you go. This is two more groups of people that you probably have never heard of that came out of Russia. As I was saying at the beginning of the episode, I have noticed that people really like these kinds of episodes about the different groups of people from Russia, and honestly, I really like them too. I think they're super interesting, and I love talking about these different groups because I don't want people to be thinking that Russia is just some kind of monoculture where just ethnically Russian people live, and that all the culture and ideas that come out of it are, ethnically Russian. Russia is an incredibly diverse place, and it has been for basically forever. So I like giving some airtime to these different groups so that we here outside of Russia can get a little bit of a better understanding, and so that maybe even people who are in Russia, because I do know there are a couple people in Russia who listen to this show, that they can maybe understand a little bit more about, the country that they're currently in. But anyhow, I think that's going to be all for us today. Thank you all for tuning in. I hope you all enjoyed today's episode, and I hope you learned something new today. If you did enjoy today's episode, or really even if you didn't, please do not hesitate to leave me a comment on whatever platform you're listening on, as I'm always trying to make the show better, and your input is really the best way for me to know what you like, what you don't like, whatever. And of course, leaving a comment does help engagement, and engagement helps grow the show and bring in new listeners. If you are interested in keeping up to date with the show, you can follow it at BTRSPod on Instagram. And as always, thank you again for listening. I hope you're having a great day, and I'll catch you for the next one. Bye-bye.